some of my favorite scenes are things that have nothing to do with the crime element or even the celebrity element. I have a nice long passage about sneakers that are thrown up on top of wires, which a lot of the big East Coast cities in the mid 20th century, this was a hallmark. You could go down, even when I was a kid in the early 70s, you could go down a street and you would see the telephone wires or the electrical cables, and you would see 3 or 4 dozen pairs of sneakers tied together and tossed up. And I don't know, do they still do that? Do you still see that
Yeah,
sometimes? Yeah,
they still do it. I remembered it a lot in the mid to late '90s. Now, it's less common, but
yeah,
you still see it around.
yeah. And that's a good example of a scene that I'm sure a lot of people who write novels today probably not only could not write, but would not want to write because it 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 gives a much more subtle into the character uh, and character development.